Jungkook sat in front of the vanity mirror in the lavish penthouse suite, barely recognizing the reflection staring back at him. He had always been a little shy, more inclined to avoid the spotlight, yet here he was, dressed in a suit that cost more than he had ever imagined, about to marry a man who'd barely even looked at him. Voices drifted down the hall, tense and argumentative. Jungkook closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to calm his nerves. Since dawn, the mansion had been filled with people bustling, arguing, perfecting every minor detail for the wedding. But now, there was nothing for him to fix, nothing for him to do, except face a reality he had never prepared for. The sound of heavy footsteps approached, and suddenly the door opened. Jungkook tensed, expecting to see his mother, or maybe his brother who'd made this mess. But it was Taehyung, standing in the doorway with an unreadable expression. Taehyung was breathtakingly handsome, dressed in a suit that somehow accentuated his imposing presence. Yet his gaze was cold, detached, and distant. "So you're ready?" Taehyung's tone was curt, devoid of any warmth. Jungkook met his gaze and nodded, his heart pounding. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was just a stand-in, a pawn in a game that didn't involve him. "Good," Taehyung replied, his voice low. "Let's get this over with." As Taehyung turned and walked away, Jungkook felt his heart sink. This wasn't how he had ever imagined marriage, but little did he know that this was just the beginning of a story filled with heartbreak, stolen glances, and the hidden desire that would entangle their fates forever. Jungkook stared at his reflection in the full-length mirror, letting out a small sigh. The tuxedo he wore was perfectly tailored, but he couldn't help feeling out of place in the stiff, formal attire. As he smoothed down the fabric, he tried to ignore the muffled voices in the hallway outside the suite. Whatever crisis was unfolding now could be resolved without him, just like all the others throughout the day. Weddings had always fascinated him. There was something beautiful about the commitment two people made, vowing to be each other's forever. Jungkook had always believed in love, in soulmates, and he'd hoped that one day he would find his own one. For a while, he thought that person might be Namjoon, his thoughtful and compassionate boyfriend. They'd built a quiet, tender relationship that brought him comfort and security. Namjoon was everything he'd ever dreamed of, kind, attentive, and supportive. He would be here today, standing in the crowd, and the idea of seeing him in a suit filled Jungkook with a bittersweet longing. But things had changed. Now, he was about to marry Taehyung Kim, a man he barely knew, let alone love. Jungkook couldn't deny Taehyung's magnetic charm, the way his mere presence commanded attention. Yet, he knew this was no fairy tale. Taehyung was a stranger with a hardened heart, someone who looked at him with a mixture of anger and disappointment, as if he were a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Jungkook closed his eyes, memories of his last conversation with Namjoon flooding back. They had both known this would happen, that duty and family loyalty would tear them apart. Namjoon had held him close that night, whispering reassurances, yet Jungkook could feel the sadness in his voice, the ache of goodbye. Lost in his thoughts, Jungkook barely registered the heavy footsteps approaching his door. He opened his eyes just as it swung open, and there stood Taehyung, tall and imposing, with an unreadable expression on his face. He stepped into the room, the air turning tense. Taehyung's gaze flicked over him, sharp and assessing. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice cold and detached. Jungkook nodded, swallowing back the nerves that threatened to betray him. "Yes." Then let's not waste any more time. Tae-hyung's tone was devoid of warmth, his eyes distant. As Tae-hyung turned to leave, Jungkook took a steady breath and followed. He knew this wasn't the love story he'd always imagined, but he also knew that life rarely followed the plans he had carefully laid out. Little did he know that as the days passed, this marriage of convenience would start to stir emotions he couldn't understand, feelings that would blur the line between resentment and desire, and would bind him and Tae-hyung together in ways he never anticipated. As Jungkook stepped forward to meet his future, he couldn't help but wonder if, despite it all, he might find his own one in the person he least expected. Jungkook fidgeted with the cuffs of his fitted cream-colored suit, feeling the fabric hugging his frame a little too tightly. His older brother, Jisoo, had chosen it for him before disappearing, leaving Jungkook with a suit that felt like a second skin but hardly allowed him to breathe. It wasn't what Jungkook would have picked for himself, but he didn't have the luxury to complain. The cream fabric softened his features, making his eyes seem darker, more intense, and highlighting the sharp jawline he had inherited from his mother. He ran his fingers through his dark hair, styled neatly back, and exhaled slowly. He could almost imagine what he looked like, sharp yet delicate, his appearance polished to fit Tae-hyung's world, one he didn't belong to. Growing up, Jungkook had always been the quiet one, the one who faded into the background, content with his simple life. Now, he was about to step into the spotlight in a marriage he had never wanted, feeling like he'd traded his identity for someone else's life. The voices outside his door grew louder, snapping him out of his thoughts. Jungkook resisted the urge to roll his eyes. From what he had gathered, nothing had gone smoothly that day, and people were on edge, tiptoeing around Tae-hyung's sharp temper. Tae-hyung had barely spoken to him, and when he did, it was with a clipped, detached tone, as if Jungkook was an inconvenience he couldn't wait to rid himself of. Taking a deep breath, Jungkook looked back at his reflection. He saw someone who looked ready, but he didn't feel it, not with the way his stomach twisted with nerves. The world outside was waiting for him to step into a role he had never asked for, by the side of a man who wanted nothing to do with him. But just as he braced himself to leave, he heard the softest of knocks, a hesitant pause before the door creaked open. Tae-hyung stood there, his expression unreadable, his eyes flickering over Jungkook with a hint of something, surprise, maybe, before his face returned to its usual mask of indifference. "Are you coming?" Tae-hyung's voice was steady, though Jungkook thought he sensed a slight edge to it. Jungkook gave a small nod. "Yes," he replied softly, unable to meet Tae-hyung's gaze for too long. But as he turned to follow, Tae-hyung's hand brushed his arm, a fleeting touch that sent an unexpected shiver down his spine. Their eyes met for a brief moment, Tae-hyung's dark, unreadable gaze piercing through Jungkook's carefully composed facade. And in that silent exchange, something shifted, a crack in the coldness between them, a hint that beneath Tae-hyung's hardened exterior, there might be more than Jungkook had dared to hope. Without another word, they walked side by side to the ceremony. And as they approached, Jungkook found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, he was about to find more than duty in this marriage, a connection, a spark, that might make this complicated journey worth every painful step. Jungkook took one last look in the mirror, adjusting the bow around his waist and smoothing out the fabric that hugged his form so closely. The cream suit accentuated his slender frame, the fit so tight it was hard to breathe. And yet, for the first time that day, he felt good. Powerful, almost as though he could face whatever came his way. Jisoo may have chosen the suit, but Jungkook had to admit, his brother had excellent taste. Just as he was steadying himself for the final breath, the door flew open, cutting off his thoughts. A group of people entered in a flurry: his mother, Teo Hyung's mother, a few stern-faced men Jungkook recognized as business associates, and his uncle Dongwon, who almost never showed up to family events. They moved in without knocking, their anxious expressions casting a shadow over the entire room. Jungkook's heart sank. Something was terribly wrong. His mother looked pale, her usual elegance marred by worry as she clutched her hands tightly, her eyes darting around the room until they settled on Jungkook. Uncle Dongwon's lips were pressed into a thin line, his brow furrowed with tension, and Tae Hyung's mother's usual warmth had been replaced with an expression of pure distress. "Jungkook," his mother said, her voice soft but strained. She took a step toward him, her hand reaching out as if to steady herself. We don't know how to tell you this, but, what is it?" Jungkook asked, a pang of dread filling his chest. He could feel his pulse quicken as his mother looked away, her silence more alarming than any words could be. "It's Tae Hyung." Tae Hyung's mother spoke up, her voice thick with unspoken emotion. He's gone." "Gone?" Jungkook echoed, feeling a chill run down his spine. "Vanished," Uncle Dongwon said, shaking his head as though the words tasted bitter. "Left without a word or a trace. No one knows where he is." And now, with the wedding, he trailed off, exchanging a look with Jungkook's mother that conveyed the seriousness of the situation. Jungkook's mind raced, trying to process what he was hearing. Tae Hyung was gone? The man he was supposed to marry in less than an hour had just disappeared? He felt a wave of shock mixed with confusion and, somewhere deep inside, a flicker of hurt. "This marriage is crucial for our families," Tae Hyung's mother said, her tone pleading. "Jungkook, please, if there's anything you can do to help us get through this." She didn't finish, but her eyes were desperate, as if clinging to him as their last hope. And in that moment, Jungkook realized that his choices were slipping away, and the expectations weighing on him were greater than he'd ever imagined. This was no longer just a marriage, it was a lifeline for everyone around him. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his shoulders, the cream suit suddenly feeling like armor. Whatever happened next, he was going to have to face it with everything he had. And perhaps, in this chaos, he might find the courage to forge a new path, one where he could stand as his own person, with or without Tae Hyung. Jungkook's heart raced as he took in the expressions of the people surrounding him. His father, usually so calm and optimistic, looked haunted, as if he were carrying a weight too heavy to bear. Tae Hyung's mother, known for her grace and control, seemed on the verge of breaking down. And Jungkook could practically feel the fury radiating from Tae Hyung's father, whose face was red with barely restrained anger, his lips pressed into a hard line. "What's going on?" Jungkook asked, his voice trembling despite his attempt to stay calm. The silence stretched, each second filled with unspoken tension. He scanned the room, waiting for someone to speak, his heart pounding as dread settled in his stomach. Finally, his aunt Soo Young stepped forward, her face a mask of sorrow that only deepened Jungkook's anxiety. "Jungkook, there's something you need to know," she began softly, her voice laced with a sadness that twisted his heart. She glanced at the others before meeting Jungkook's gaze, her eyes filled with a kind of pity that only made him more uneasy. "What is it?" he whispered, barely able to keep his voice steady. The tension in the room was suffocating, every face around him painted with worry and pain. Tae-hyung, he's not here, Aunt Soo-young finally said, her voice cracking slightly. He left this morning, without a word, without telling anyone where he was going. Jungkook felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. What do you mean? He left. His mind raced, struggling to comprehend. Tae-hyung, the man he was about to marry, had disappeared? Cold disbelief settled over him, mingling with hurt and confusion. The man who had barely looked at him, who treated him as little more than an inconvenience, had simply vanished? Tae-hyung's father cleared his throat, his voice tense with barely contained anger. We don't know why he left, or where he's gone, he said sharply, glaring at the room as if daring anyone to ask questions. But we can't let this ruin everything we've worked for. Jungkook's gaze dropped to the floor, his mind spinning. This marriage wasn't just about him and Tae-hyung. It was a union meant to protect both families, to secure their futures. And now, with Tae-hyung gone, everything was in jeopardy. Part of him felt a pang of betrayal, a sharp ache that Tae-hyung had taken the easy way out, leaving him to face the consequences alone. We need you, Jungkook, Tae-hyung's mother said softly, her voice breaking through his chaotic thoughts. She stepped closer, her expression pleading. This marriage is the only thing holding our families together. We are asking you, please, stay with us, just a little longer. We'll find a way to make this work. Jungkook took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. This was never what he'd wanted, but standing here, surrounded by their silent desperation, he realized he had no choice. He would have to step forward, even if it meant facing an uncertain future alone. Squaring his shoulders, he nodded, determination settling over him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would meet them with resilience. And perhaps, somewhere along this path, he might find the courage to forge his own story, even without Tae-hyung by his side.